morning. My name is Diane Proctor, and I'm the president of the League of Women Voters here in Concord and Carlisle, and I want to welcome everyone. The first thing I want to say is that, Carlin, are you way back there?
Yes, I am.
If you cannot hear, you must stand up and wave, okay? Can you hear us now? Yes? Yes, okay, so whoever is up here, we have to speak right into this microphone as if it were an extension of our of our mouths. We're very sorry for the placement of this podium. It was meant to be in the middle. So if you have a slightly obstructed view, don't hesitate to move your chairs and come around so that you can see and hear. As well, the microphone is attached to this device, which means we're not going to be able to move around. So it's going to require you to move rather than us moving, and for that we apologize. Thank you all for coming out on this beautiful Saturday morning. It means a great deal to us and to the League. And a particularly warm welcome this morning to Tammy Gavea, our newest state representative. And to the more experienced Mike Barrett, our state senator.
Well, older.
Well, and whose legislation we've been supporting for a very long time. He cares as much as we do about issues having to do with energy. And every effort you make in that regard, Mike, we're right behind you, and we know how important that is. We also send greetings to Laurie Tron, who is presently in Washington, D.C., and according to the bill passed last night, she may actually begin to be a legislator. So this is really very exciting. So we send a little hello to Laurie, if all that really happens, for at least 3 weeks. It's not that she's been doing nothing down there, but now a chance to be even more active. There are so many people to thank before we begin. First, I would like to thank the Colonial Inn and their staff for helping to make this event possible. We are grateful for their support and for their effort. I also want to thank our fantastic events chair, Stefan Bader, and his support team, Carlin Reed and Nancy Bucas, and Reiner, wherever you are, thank you for all the stuff that you do to help us do all of this, technically and emotionally. Our fantastic and imaginative and energetic membership chair, Ann Hayden. Ann, are you out from behind the table yet? No, she's still back there saying hello to everybody that comes in. And but here's to Ann. And our tireless adept treasurer, Robert Hilsinger, without whom none of this would be possible. And of course, for this morning in particular, a woman who greeted me when I first joined the League, who's made all the difference in the world to me, our steadfast chair of the Immigration Committee, Nancy Cronin. Nancy will be, in a few moments, will introduce our speaker, Aviva Chomsky. We are lucky to have Aviva here this morning. She's just come back from Dublin, where she's been giving all sorts of interviews. She's a woman much in demand, and so we are lucky and fortunate beyond words to have her here with us. In typical League fashion, let me explain how this will go. After Avi speaks, we will pose some prepared questions formulated by members of our Immigration Committee. And then we will open our discussion from our guests. A note again, we must leave here promptly at 11. There's another event taking place in this room. We can be over there if we'd like to be, but we may not be in this room. So we will say thank you very much and leave promptly at 11 o'clock. Now, a few thoughts. Immigration is, after all, about borders, artificial borders, defined by man and reinforced by both physical and mental barriers. In her elegant novel, Go Went Gone, by Jenny Erpenbeck, a piece that we're reading in the League reading group. For anybody who has read it, you're more than welcome to join us. Go to our website to see when we're meeting twice, once in the morning and once in the evening. And we're also reading Aviva's book, They Take Our Jobs. So this combination of books has been powerful for all of us. And I recommend this book and other works of Aviva, incidentally. But But in Jenny Erpenbeck's address, she talks about borders. She describes a scene where immigrants stand on one side of a barrier and police stand on the other side. And she writes, "And are the two groups of people facing off here something like the two halves of the universe that actually belong together, but whose separation is nonetheless irrevocable? Is the rift dividing them, in fact, a bottomless chasm? Is that why such powerful turbulences have been released? And is a rift between black and white, is that the rift? Are poor and rich, stranger and friend? Are those with curly hair and those with straight? Those who call their dinner fufu and those who call it stew? Are those who like to wear yellow, red, and green t-shirts and those who prefer neckties? Are those who like to drink water and those who prefer beer? Are between speakers of one language and another? How many borders exist within a single universe? Or to ask it differently, what is the one true crucial border? Perhaps the border between that which is dead and that which is alive? Or between the stars and the lump of earth we walk on every day? What divides us from each other?" And Nancy Cronin will now introduce Aviva Chomsky.
Well, the League of Women Voters has been studying immigration for a while. In 2008, the National League had a national study, and as a result, we have very strong positions on immigration issues. Here is the summary of our immigration position. Promote reunification of immediate families, meet the economic, business, and employment needs of the U.S., be responsive to those facing political persecution or humanitarian crises, and provide for student visas. Ensure fair treatment under the law for all persons in transition to a reformed system. Support provisions for unauthorized immigrants already in the country to earn legal status. So that is, in general, what our stand is, and so we can take their actions based on that stand, which is in actually much more detail than that.
You have to get closer, honey.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah, I know, it's great.
All right. I'd like very much to introduce our speaker, Aviva Chomsky. She has spent many years in thinking about, writing about the issues having to do with immigrants. She is a professor of history and coordinator of Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean studies at Salem University. Her books include, her many books, Undocumented, How Immigrants Became Illegal, A History of the Cuban Revolution, and the one that the League is reading right now, They Take Our Jobs, and 20 Other Myths About Immigration, along with many, many other books. I think Aviva has some very interesting ideas that we might be able to take as actions that we can make in our own state. So I'd like to introduce Aviva Chomsky.
Thank you so much. Am I standing close enough?
No.
No. Okay.
Really, you have to practically eat it.
Now am I standing close enough? No?
You need to bend it up.
Okay, how about this? Got it? Okay, again, do the same thing. Wave at me from the back if I move too far away or if it slides down and I don't notice. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here this morning. Thank you for all coming out on this lovely morning. Definitely nicer than last Saturday, right? I was flying out to Dublin last Saturday. I was one of the last flights to make it out before they started canceling them all. So I was listening to NPR on my way out here on the lovely drive from Salem. And they talked about 3 issues on the morning edition. So those of you who heard it also heard the discussion of these 3 issues. Those of you who didn't probably saw it on the front page of today's paper or in other places. One is Venezuela, the crisis, the ongoing crisis in Venezuela, and the current and potentially greater U.S. role in that crisis. 2 is the government shutdown, the end of the government shutdown, and the continuing debate over Trump's demand for $2.7 billion for a wall. And 3, which actually I did not see in the paper this morning, but they mentioned on NPR, and I had read about it yesterday, the collapse of a dam at a mine in Brazil. This is the second huge mining disaster in Brazil in the last 10 years, where a dam has collapsed, leading to a flood of toxic waste mining tailings that has overrun villages, killed numerous people, contaminated land, left hundreds homeless. So all 3 of these issues are connected, and they're connected to what I want to talk about this morning. So I just wanted to mention them so you can keep them in the back of your minds, and I'll try to come back to them as I go along. I want to make sure I watch my watch because I have half an hour, right?
Or so.
Okay, I won't count those first few minutes. I'll start my half an hour now. So I was also struck as I walked in here this morning with some of the flyers that are on the tables and signs on the way in that say, what is climate change? How do local actions matter? And that was a lot of how I thought about how I wanted to frame my talk this morning, is how do local actions matter? Why do local actions matter? It seems like our national government is in an insoluble confrontation that it may seem like we at the local level can't do much about. But I do want to emphasize the importance of the local level and what our elected representatives can do and what we can do as constituents of our elected representatives, both at the very local level, at the Massachusetts state level, and in terms of the Massachusetts delegation at the national level, because I think Massachusetts has played a really important role at the national level in all 3 of these kinds of issues. So I would say that at the state level, there are a number of really important ways that our local representatives can play a role in immigration. One is 3 pieces of legislation specifically related to immigration and immigrant rights in Massachusetts, where Massachusetts is a laggard. Many, many other states have taken these 3 steps, and Massachusetts has not. We've tried over and over again, and we have failed over and over again. They've been brought up in the legislature and died in committee. They've been voted on in the legislature and been voted down. They've been voted on in the legislature and approved and then vetoed by a governor. So we remain an outlier among states in terms of our regressive policies towards immigrants in Massachusetts. These 3 pieces of legislation, one of them is actually on the floor of the legislature right now. I don't know if you guys are co-sponsors, but if you're not, you could be. Which is authorizing driver's licenses for people who are undocumented. Many states do this. They've devised all kinds of different ways to do it, but state after state has found some way to do it. Some give regular driver's licenses. Some have created special driver's licenses that cannot count as a federal ID. There's many different ways it could happen, but Massachusetts has not done it at all. Now, why is this such an important issue? It's almost impossible to survive in this state without driving. It's almost impossible to work, to get your children to school, to shop for groceries, to do anything in this state without driving. That's our fault. We've devised a system based on highways. I tried to get here by public transportation this morning. It was not possible. There's no train out to Concord that would have gotten me here. Even if I had managed to get into Boston earlier, which I can do from Salem, I could not have gotten out to Concord. And it's an hour and 45-minute bike ride from North Station, which I just thought I wasn't ready to do this morning at 25 degrees. So people who are undocumented need to drive to survive. They are currently not able to get any kind of authorization to drive in Massachusetts. This means that they have not passed a driving test. We would all benefit by making sure that everybody who is out on the road has passed a driving test. But people who are undocumented can't take the driving test. So, of course, they don't bother. They don't go to driver education, and they drive without permission. This also subjects them to arrest, detention, and deportation. One of the main ways that immigrants in the interior of the United States enter into the detention and deportation system is being picked up for driving without a license. So it's a system designed to detain and deport people. And this is precisely why so many states have created a driver's license. Now, this morning, Governor Baker announced that if the legislation passed, he was going to veto it. So we have to work even harder to override the veto than we do to just pass the legislation. The second type of legislation that many, many states have passed, beginning of all places with Texas, is in-state tuition for undocumented students. Now, when young people, up until they graduate from high school, there is no discrimination against young people who are undocumented in the school system. Since 1982, a Supreme Court decision, it's been illegal for schools to discriminate against children who are undocumented. They cannot ask about documentation status, and schools must educate all children equally without discrimination, regardless of status. However, when young people graduate from high school, and many of them have been here since they were infants or young children, others arrived during their high school years, but when they graduate from high school, there is no path left open to them. They can't work. If they're undocumented, they don't have permission to work. They can't get a driver's license. They can't open a bank account. And they can't attend an institution of higher education because, at least in the public system, they cannot be considered state residents. So if a student who's undocumented wants to come to Salem State, they have to apply as an out-of-state or international student and pay a much higher tuition than they would could they qualify as in-state. Now, after President Obama created DACA in 2012, many undocumented youth were able to obtain DACA status. And here's one good thing that Massachusetts did. It has agreed to offer in-state tuition to students who have DACA. But many undocumented youth do not have DACA. There's many different reasons why they might not have DACA. DACA is very restrictive in terms of the age you were brought to the United States, your current age, a whole lot of restrictions on DACA that mean there are large numbers of undocumented youth who would like to go to college, but who can't come to Salem State or other public institutions because they don't have DACA, so they can't be considered in-state residents. So in-state tuition for undocumented students is another piece of legislation that has come up again and again in the legislature. It has either failed or once when it passed, it was vetoed. So we are an outlier here. Almost, I would say about almost a third of the states in the United States do offer in-state tuition to undocumented students, but Massachusetts does not. The third piece of legislation is partially symbolic, but it's still very important. It's the Safe Communities Act, which again, other states have passed similar legislation. Massachusetts has been unable to pass this. The Safe Communities Act says that to the extent legally permitted by federal law, Massachusetts law enforcement agencies will not become the enforcers of immigration law. This means that if a Massachusetts police officer stops somebody for a traffic violation, they cannot ask about their immigration status. They cannot voluntarily take the initiative to share that information with ICE, the Immigration Customs Enforcement, the guys who deport people, and that they do not have to honor federal ICE detainers when somebody is released from custody. So Safe Communities does not ask any law enforcement officials to violate federal law, but they state that we will do only the minimum required by federal law in terms of collaboration with immigration enforcement. Once again, other states have passed similar legislation, Massachusetts has not. So those are three things to have on your agenda to be thinking about. Even beyond that, there's other ways in which Massachusetts policies, I think, are really important for immigration. In some ways, all social and racial justice issues are immigrant rights issues. Immigrants are primarily people of color. They're primarily poor. So I don't know how many of you saw last week in the Boston Globe magazine, they did a 10-year retrospective follow-up, I see a few people nodding, on class valedictorians from the city of Boston. What happened to them 10 years later? How many of them were able to achieve their dreams? The vast majority of these young people are immigrants. And the vast majority of them were not able to achieve their dreams because of the multiple burdens on young people of color going through the Boston school system and moving out into the world. One of the most dramatic stories was of a young woman who graduated from Dartmouth after graduating from Boston Public High School, graduated from Dartmouth, and when the Boston Globe found her and interviewed her, she was in a homeless shelter. So how did this happen? The series, I really urge you to go back and look at the series. It's available online. But it really gives you an idea at the multiple factors working against these youth, which I would put almost all under the category of social and racial justice. They also noticed that comparable students, class valedictorians from the suburbs or from Boston's exam schools, shot up. It was from the rest of Boston schools that were crushed down. So education issues are a social and racial justice issue that is very important to immigrants. So I feel like we really need to see social and racial justice as immigration issues. A third area is climate and energy issues, which likewise have a disproportionate effect on poor people and people of color globally, whether they are immigrants in the United States or whether they are poor people and people of color in their home countries like Central America or like the villages in Brazil that were just destroyed by the mine disaster there. That is climate issues, issues of extractivism, extraction of natural resources, use of natural resources, and our overuse of natural resources, especially energy resources in this country, obviously contribute to climate change, but they have a far disproportionate influence or impact on poor people of color, whether they are immigrants in the United States or whether they are villagers being displaced in Brazil who in 5 or 10 years may be forced into immigration in the United States. So I think our local actions on climate issues are very deeply related to immigration issues. I keep looking at you guys, sorry. You're in the hot seat here. Finally, and here I'm connecting more to what's going on in Venezuela. And this refers more to our congressional delegation than necessarily to our state legislature. But U.S. foreign policy plays a huge role in immigration to the United States. And that's actually where I'm going to devote a few minutes here. But the Massachusetts congressional delegation has developed a strong reputation of opposing U.S. intervention in Latin America and understanding the ways in which U.S. intervention in Latin America has been a key factor provoking environmental disaster, social disaster, war, and the inevitable result of those three, which is outmigration, people fleeing to the United States. So I would urge you to keep up the pressure on our elected congressional delegation to oppose U.S. military intervention in Venezuela. We know what the results of that will be because we have seen it over and over again throughout our history. And to stand up for what the reputation that our delegation has developed. So far, they've been really reluctant to speak out on Venezuela. They need to. I always get warm when I'm speaking. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the wall specifically, and the history of who is coming to the United States right now and why, and how it's related to everything I've just sort of put out before you right now. Is there a crisis at the border? Yes. What is the cause of that crisis? The cause of that crisis is the militarization of the border that has turned this border, and here I also refer to the introduction and the reference to Go Went Gone, turning a border from an orderly place of passage into a war zone. This has been a deliberate U.S. policy to turn this border into a war zone and to create a humanitarian crisis at the border. I was down at the border in 2010 and saw with my own eyes. This was before Trump was president, right? Obama was president. The border is a war zone, and it's a war zone created by U.S. policy. There's also a crisis in Central America. That is what's causing a lot of people to flee Central America. And as they flee the US-created crisis in their countries, they come to another US-created crisis on the border. Now, according to our president, the crisis on the border has to do with the increasing numbers of people who are banging on the doors demanding to get into the United States. But if you actually look at the numbers, border crossings have been decreasing consistently since 2008. The vast majority of border crossers are Mexican. Whether they enter with inspection, that is through a border control point, or whether they enter without inspection, that is not going through a border control point. And the numbers of Mexicans coming to the United States have been steadily declining since about 2010. This has nothing to do with our border policies. It has to do with the U.S. economic crisis of 2008 and the subsequent loss of jobs. Most Mexican migrants, historically, for the last 150 years, have been people who have come recruited by U.S. employers, whether in agriculture, in mining, in railroad building, and increasingly, since the late 20th century, in a newly expanded low-end service sector of things like landscaping, nannying, fast food. They have been recruited to work in the lowest and most exploited ends of the US economy. With the downturn in 2008, combined with improvements in the Mexican economy around the same time, and a lowering of the birth rate in Mexico, more and more Mexicans are making the rational decision to stay home. And Mexican border crossing has been increasingly going down. That's kind of complicated. Decreasing, let's say. However, at the same time, structural factors have made Central American migration skyrocket since 2008. So I want to take 7 minutes to just talk a little bit about that background. Why is Central American migration suddenly going up? Now, the Central American countries are much smaller than Mexico. The numbers are, that means the overall number is still declining, even as Central American migration is rising. Central Americans are coming from 3 countries overwhelmingly: Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. There's very few people crossing the border from Nicaragua, from Belize, from Costa Rica, from Panama. It's the 3 countries known as the Northern Triangle that are the primary sending countries. These countries are all in crisis, and they are the people who are confronting the US-created crisis on the border. Why? I was asked earlier this week to give a history of Central America in 1 sentence. So here's my sentence. It evolves, it repeats, but it basically, the pattern was set down in 1492, and all it's done is reiterate itself, and it is still doing that. So here's the sentence. White people come. They bring a lot of guns. They displace indigenous people from their land, so they take native lands. They force native people into labor in order to extract resources for the profits of individuals and the rising standard of living of the first world. And then there's a follow-up, which is, and when those native people try to protest or resist, the guns come out to make sure that this system continues for the profit of individuals and increasingly corporations, mostly US-based corporations, and for the increasing standard of living in the first world. So I hope you can see some connections to climate issues in terms of our consumption, and to racial and social justice issues here. So just to give a really quick overview of how this process has repeated itself over many years. It starts, of course, with the Spanish coming, bringing a lot of guns, displacing native peoples from their land and forcing them into labor, primarily extracting gold and silver for the profit of individual Spaniards and to contribute to a rising standard of living in Europe as a whole. So the profits are concentrated in the hands of the conquerors, but they're also dispersed throughout Europe. Central America becomes independent in the 19th century, and governance remains in the hands of that Hispanic, that is Spanish-descended elite in Central America, who continue a process of displacing native people from their lands and forcing their labor in order to extract resources. In the 19th century, it's primarily coffee and bananas. For the profit of foreign corporations in Central America, specifically the United Fruit Company, a Boston-based company, extracting their resources for export to the United States for the benefit of the profits of the companies and the rising standard of living of the population. So still today, the vast majority of the bananas we eat come from Central America or northern South America, coastal northern South America, Colombia and Ecuador. So if you look in your supermarket, I can guarantee that one of the Central American countries, Colombia or Ecuador, will be the source of your bananas. So we're still displacing people from their land and forcing them into labor to produce resources for the profits of corporations and the benefit of the US population. In 1954, there's many indigenous rebellions against this system, fighting for their land, for their workers' rights. In the 1870s in Nicaragua, in 1932 in El Salvador. These were armed uprisings that were put down very bloodily, and increasingly with US aid, under the rationale that these people must be communists if they're opposing the interests of US corporations in these countries. In 1948, in Guatemala, the rebellion comes about through a democratic election. And in 1954, the United States decides that this democratically elected government that is addressing the two fundamental problems of Central America, that is the rights of indigenous people to their land and the rights of workers to a decent life, to organize, to safe working conditions, to a decent living wage, that we cannot allow those things to go on in Central America. They threaten US corporate interests, and so the United States carries out its first post-war military intervention and coup in Latin America against a democratically elected government in order to restore the corporate-dominated order that will continue carrying out the system of expropriation of land, forced labor, extraction of natural resources, corporate profits, and increasing standard of living in the United States. In the 1980s, 1970s, there are rebellions throughout Central America to try to overturn this model. In Nicaragua, there's a successful revolution in 1979, which of course the United States, and which starts to put into place land and labor reforms. Of course, the United States labels it communist, and under the government of Ronald Reagan, with the help of Secretary of State Elliott Abrams, who's just been brought out of obscurity to manage U.S. intervention in Venezuela right now. The United States sets itself out to overthrow the democratically elected government in Nicaragua after the revolution in '79. They quickly organize elections in 1984. There's democratic elections, which are won by the Revolutionary Party. That doesn't matter to the United States. Elections don't matter. What matters is the government following the policies that the United States wants, particularly in relation to economy, land, and labor. And there's also revolutions in El Salvador and Guatemala. The United States turns Honduras into basically an aircraft base. The entire country is flooded with US military personnel, guns, in order to support right-wing governments in El Salvador and Guatemala that are shedding a lot of blood to destroy these popular movements. In the 1990s, peace treaties are signed in Guatemala and El Salvador, and the old order is essentially restored. There's some new things being extracted, a lot flooding in of US and Canadian corporations in mining, in new non-traditional agricultural exports like broccoli and different kinds of fruit, berries, and also the beginnings of a maquiladora sector in Central America. And I can guarantee if you look at the labels on your clothes, every other person in this room is wearing an item of clothing that was made in Central America in one of these maquiladoras. Again, taking of native lands and labor to provide for corporate profits and increase in standard of living in the United States. In 2009, getting to the present, we have again a repeat of what happened in Guatemala in 1948. We have a populist president elected in Honduras who goes back to those same old policies of restoring land to indigenous communities and policies in favor of the poor and especially of workers' rights in Honduras. Once again, the United States, now under President Obama, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, decide that this can't happen, and they move in to orchestrate a coup in Honduras, which brought back into power the traditional elite in a right-wing government, flooding the country with guns, creating the humanitarian crisis that is today Honduras, and that has made Honduras the largest source of people fleeing to the United States. El Salvador and Guatemala are also, through the rubric of the drug wars, receiving huge amounts of military aid. Again, when we flood a country with guns, violence is the result. Violence, corruption, a blurring of the lines between official and unofficial violence in all of these countries. The collapse of the dam in Brazil, many of the indigenous people who have been killed in these countries in the past 10 years have been environmental activists, people who are still fighting for native rights to their lands, now against U.S. agricultural corporations, U.S. mining corporations. So the collapse of the dam in Brazil, this particular dam was actually owned by the Brazilian state company, Vale, but the previous mining disaster was a joint venture between Vale and BHP Billiton, the largest multinational mining company in the world, based in London. So my time is up, and I would say that the flood of refugees coming from Central America are fleeing from a US-created crisis in their country. We've been hard at work to create a similar crisis in Venezuela over the past 10 years, and now we are pushing to bring this crisis to a head, to bring our traditional allies, the traditional elite of Venezuela, back into power, with the confidence that they are going to reverse the social policies, reverse the land restoration, reverse the labor protections, reverse the programs to redistribute Venezuela's oil wealth to the poor that have been implemented since the election of Hugo Chavez in 1998. So we're witnessing the next crisis in the making right now. And inevitably, there's already floods of refugees leaving Venezuela, and there will be more if we succeed in restoring our elite representatives and our economic model in Venezuela as well. Let me just say one more thing about the League of Women Voters stance, because I read it quickly. I really liked the part that you read aloud, but if you go into it, there's one part that I would really challenge you on, and I hope you will rethink, which is the League's support for employer sanctions and the E-Verify program. Employer sanctions is a policy that was created under the Reagan administration in 1986, and it's a policy to criminalize work by people who are undocumented. Prior to 1986, there were no legal restrictions on working for people who are undocumented. The part of the 1986 immigration law that created employer sanctions, they call it employer sanctions, as if it's the employer who's going to be punished for hiring people who are undocumented. But in fact, it's the workers who are punished. And employer sanctions is a way of demeaning and exploiting immigrant workers, making them more vulnerable, basically doing the same thing to Central American workers in the United States that has been done to Central American workers in their countries ever since 1492. That is implementing legalized ways of exploiting and demeaning workers by increasing employer power and decreasing workers' rights. So I stand very strongly against the employer sanction system, and I urge you to rethink that. Okay, now I really will end.
Extraordinarily stimulating, and so many questions emerge. Nancy Cronin is going to start. Thank you, Julie. Nancy Cronin is going to start by asking some questions that came from the League Immigration Committee, and then we're opening it up for questions from all of you. I urge you to speak up loudly when you ask your question. We will repeat your questions, if they are succinct, from the podium.
Okay, our Immigration Committee has been working for the last 2 years to learn more about what is going on, especially around in our area. There are now we have some ideas on what we can do within Massachusetts, which is very, very helpful. And I think our representative and our senator will make quite a bit of those ideas. And sanctuary cities, of course, is one of the things that the League has been working very hard to get passed. So hopefully, maybe this year it could get passed. So some of the questions from our committee there are as follows. The first one, prior to the current administration, what was the quota system that was in place at that time, and what is it now? Where is she?
Next to no, I know. Come on over. I was hiding behind you. Borders.
So the United States has been operating under a quota system since the early 20th century. In the early 20th century, the quota system was explicitly and deliberately racist. That is, you know how Trump said, we don't want immigrants from shithole countries like Haiti. We want immigrants from countries like Norway. And everybody said, oh, how can he say that? Well, that actually has been U.S. immigration law for most of U.S. history. That is, until the Civil War, only white people were allowed to be citizens of the United States. There was a huge encouragement of white immigration during this period in order to create a white country on native lands and to maintain a subject labor force of people from Africa. So it's not only in Central America that the slogan, European people came, white people came, they brought lots of guns, they took native lands and extracted the labor of people of color for their own benefit. That characterizes U.S. history as well. So until the Civil War, immigration was state-sponsored and heavily encouraged and was by definition European. Only Europeans could be considered immigrants. People from Africa were also forcibly brought to the United States, but they were not considered immigrants. One could say there was an open border. One could also say there was a moving border, because the 19th century, if you think about what were the 13 colonies that declared independence in 1776, they embarked on an immediate program of expansion. So between 1776 and the Civil War, or perhaps until maybe 1910, the United States is engaged in a perpetual state of war against the native populations of the country to exterminate or remove them. So this project of the taking of native lands was a several hundred-year process that many would say is still ongoing, as reservations are being threatened and dismantled, especially where there are natural resources that corporations want to extract on these reservations. So again, it's an ongoing and familiar story. After the Civil War, citizenship was granted to the Afro-descended population of the United States. And at the same time, so this is the first time that citizenship is opened up racially. At the same time, naturalization is opened up, which means that immigration is opened up. Because immigration is the coming to the United States of people who are on a path to citizenship. That's the definition of immigration. So immigration is also opened up a little bit by opening immigration. Now it's not only white people, it is also persons of African nativity or African descent. This is in 1870 with the Second Naturalization Law that expands it beyond white people, but only a little bit. That is, in 1870 when this new law is passed, how many people do you think are coming to the United States from Africa or want to come to the United States from Africa? Okay, you all get that. But immigrants are coming to the United States in 1870 from China. They're coming from Mexico. Those people are not able to naturalize because they are neither free white persons nor persons of African nativity and African descent. They are not considered immigrants. Now, however, the 14th Amendment puts a wrinkle in this because the 14th Amendment creates citizenship by birth. Any person born in the United States is a citizen of the United States. So what happens to those people who are defined by Congress as racially ineligible to citizenship, like Mexicans and Chinese, who are born in the United States? They become what a historian of immigration May Nye called impossible subjects. Like they can't exist because they're racially ineligible to citizenship and yet they're citizens. This is when Congress starts to place restrictions on immigration. First, the very first one is against Chinese women, under the rationale that if there's no women, they can't give birth, so that will prevent these racially ineligible people from becoming citizens. They soon realized that that didn't work well enough and they have to prohibit all Chinese, because Chinese men seem to be finding other ways of having children, even without Chinese women. So in 1882, they prohibit all Chinese. Now, Chinese and Mexican labor are absolutely essential for the economic development of the newly conquered territories or territories that are in the process of conquest in the American West. Note that in the Mexican-American War, Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, the United States took from Mexico huge swaths of territory of what is now the southern and western United States. But most of that territory, although it was claimed by Mexico, was unconquered. That is, it was native land. It was autonomous native land inhabited by autonomous native peoples. That's why the late 19th century is the period of the Indian Wars, where white conquerors are trying to establish their sovereignty over the native lands of the West and Southwest. In order to do this and to extract the resources from that land, they need workers. Once the Chinese are prohibited, they rely even more heavily on Mexican workers. So a very strong system of recruitment of Mexican workers to work in the southern and western United States is developed. And it's a revolving door system. That is, Mexicans are imported and deported. That's how the system avoids Mexicans taking advantage of citizenship by birth. So the deportation of Mexicans goes all the way back to the very beginning of the 20th century or the end of the 19th century. The use of Mexicans as a seasonal labor force who are not eligible for citizenship. In 1917, 1921, and 1924, there are 3 laws that start to place restrictions on European immigration. And this is what we know of as the quota system. But note that this was a quota system for Europeans that ranked Europeans from the best ones, like Norway, down to the worst ones, like Greece and Italy and Poland, all of those like non-Protestant weird people who cook with garlic and do stuff that the Anglo-Saxons don't like. So this is the origins of the quota system. It's a system for privileging Northern Europeans over Central and Southern Europeans that continues to exclude most of the world, everything from Central Asia through South Asia and East Asia, that is the most populous parts of the world, and that does not put any restrictions on this circular Mexican migration. There are no restrictions on migration from the Western Hemisphere during this quota period. So hundreds of thousands of Mexicans continue to cross the border every year through official guest worker programs or simply through an open border where they are invited to work temporarily and then be deported back to Mexico. So the quota system does not affect this ongoing process in the South and West. It's a system aimed at Europeans. Now, in 1965, this quota system is overturned and replaced with a new quota system. I bet you didn't expect this long an answer. But it's necessary. 1965, think about it, it's the civil rights era, the era of decolonization, the era of the Cold War, where the United States is trying to promote itself in the international arena as a beacon of democracy and human rights. The quota system has to go. The discriminatory immigration laws, the racially discriminatory citizenship and immigration laws have to go in the 1960s, and they do. They're replaced with the system that we still have now, which is known as a uniform quota system. Every single country of the world gets the same quota, 20,000 per year. But think about it. There's one part of the world that's made up of a lot of really small countries. Belgium, Luxembourg, Switzerland. Those countries get 20,000 a year. There's another part of the world that's made up of a lot of really big countries with really big populations, like China, Indonesia, India, the Philippines. Countries where migration has been prohibited because the peoples of those countries were racially ineligible to citizenship. Those countries also get a quota of 20,000 a year. And there's countries like Mexico that have a deeply entrenched system of seasonal border crossing migration, which is simply not acknowledged in this new law. Thus, even though the border is still open, now the rationale for the deportability of Mexicans is that they're illegal. They're not under the quota. So illegality as we know it today was really created by this restrictive law in 1965 that for the first time placed a quota on migration from Mexico. That system is still the system that we follow, which is why, for most Europeans, it's really easy to immigrate to the United States. And for most people of color in poor parts of the world, it's virtually impossible to immigrate to the United States. Within the quota system, there's sort of two paths to get access to one of those coveted quota spots. Two priorities. One is people with close family relations in the United States, and there's a priority set up of what counts as close, what's closest, what's next. And the other is congressionally mandated needed employment skills. So these visas tend to go to people like high-tech workers, people in high-demand categories who have high levels of education. This means that for the vast majority of people in Mexico, there is simply no path. It's not just that you have to fight with millions of other people for one of those 20,000 quota slots. It's that you can't even enter the line. There is no line. There is no line. So that's a really important point when people talk about, oh, well, they should get in line. There is no line. And I should also mention that for poor people of color in the third world, it's also virtually impossible to get a tourist visa. Now, there's no numerical limit, there's no quota on tourist, student, business, other kinds of temporary visas. But if you aren't a wealthy person who owns a lot of property and has a bank account, you will never be granted a tourist visa. So there are many people, undocumented people or people with documents, poor people of color in the United States who are immigrants, who cannot, their family members cannot visit them. Basically what we've done, and here I return to Go Went Gone, is we've created a system of global apartheid, and that's what our border does. It separates the wealthy countries, and in her case Germany, but it's the same system of global apartheid, from the world's poor. It locks the world's poor into their countries. It turns the countries of the third world into prisons, which people cannot leave because no country will let them in, either as a tourist or a visitor or an immigrant. How's that for a reply?
Whoa.
Thank you.
That was the other talk I was thinking about giving.
Okay, we really needed that. Thank you so much. Another question is a very general one, and I don't know whether you are feeling comfortable on answering this one, but it seems to me that the root of this administration's and their followers' actions is the fear that white citizens will lose their status and power. So how do we start to address these fears about people of different colors and religions and move toward a more ethnically diverse society?
Okay. So I want to address two pieces of that question. First, the piece that asks, how can we move to a more ethnically diverse society? I would say that we already are an ethnically diverse society, but we are a very segregated and unequal ethnically diverse society. So that the real question should be, how can we turn our unequal and segregated society, our own internal form of apartheid, which you see in the school system if you read the Boston Globe last week. That is, the school systems in the Boston area operate under a system of apartheid, where white students have access to suburban schools, suburbs that were deliberately built to exclude people of color, and I really recommend you read Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law that looks at how this process happened. If you have any questions about it, it was a series of deliberate federal policies to segregate the United States over the entire course of the 20th century through federal investment and federal policies to remove white people from the cities and create privileged white enclaves while concentrating poor people of color in ghettos in the cities. It's not something that just happened. It's a result of policy. Richard Rothstein, The Color of Law. And part of the way this policy plays out now is through the school systems. That is, students who attend schools in the suburbs have infinitely greater life chances than students who attend schools in Boston, except for the exam schools in Boston, from which students of color are systematically excluded. So the exam schools are overwhelmingly populated by white and Asian students, while the rest of the Boston public school system is overwhelmingly dominated by poor people of color. So I should also say that we have a bifurcated immigration in the United States. That is, we have a large immigration of very poor people and a small immigration of very wealthy people. The town of Lexington, where I grew up, is much more diverse now than it was when I grew up there. It was an all-white suburb when I grew out there, like so many other all-white suburbs. It's now become diverse through the integration of wealthy professionals from India and China. Poor people of color are still not welcome in Lexington except as maids and servants and landscapers. So I won't speak about Concord since I've never lived here, but I don't imagine it's all that different from Lexington. So yes, I would argue that we are already ethnically diverse. What we need to address is these social justice issues. How can we become less segregated and more equal? How can we give poor people of color equal opportunity instead of an internal apartheid that replicates the global apartheid that tries to keep them out? The second part of the question has to do with the Trump administration and its supporters. If you look at my book, Undocumented, it was published in 2014. And I focus mostly on the Bush and especially on the Obama administrations. Well, guess what? Building a border wall did not start with President Trump. It started with President Clinton, a Democrat. Greatly increasing internal enforcement of immigration laws and raising deportation and thus family separation. That is, I'd like to emphasize that every single deportation is a family separation. There is no immigrant in the United States who does not have family. Every deportation is a family separation. When President Obama raised immigration levels over those during the Bush administration to 400,000 a year, more than had ever been deported from the United States before, year after year, he was implementing a policy of family separation. So Trump's policies, there's ways in which Trump has been particularly egregious in his interpretation and enforcement and manipulation of immigration law, but he's really not as much of an outlier as we like to think. He is fulfilling policies that have been in place since the founding of the country and have been, starting with the Clinton administration, greatly exacerbated. Some of the most punitive and deportation-focused immigration laws that we have were passed under the Clinton administration. Also, the laws that started building the militarization of the border and forcing people into highly risky and dangerous desert crossings, those are also developed under the Clinton administration. So I would not give the Democrats a break here in even as, of course, we need to focus on what's happening now and what President Trump is doing now, but it's also, I think, important. And if you look at the debate that's going on in Congress right now, the mainstream Democrat position is, well, yes, we don't want the wall because that's what Trump wants. Even though it was Democrats who built the wall, we already have a wall. This is nothing new. We have a wall. He's just talking about building a little more of a wall that we already have. And it was built by President Clinton. So the Democrats have never been against a wall until it's Trump who wants a wall, and now they're against it because they don't like Trump. But what the Democrats are asking for is $5.7 billion for border security of other forms. That's what Pelosi's position is. That's what the Democratic Party position is. So they want a more high-tech border. They want more drones. They want more border patrol. They want that $5.7 billion to be put into border security. It's just because Trump wants a wall, they have to say they want it for something else. So I do not stand with the Democratic Party as a party on this. Of course, there are some Democrats who oppose the border militarization and border security regime, but they're few and far between. And we need our Massachusetts representatives to speak up more loudly on this, too.
We now feel, probably there are people in the audience who want to ask some questions, and we will take their questions now.
Yes.
Could you point to any country that has a model immigration naturalization policy that we might look at?
I'll repeat it. So the question is, could I point to any country that has a model immigration and naturalization policy that we could look to, right? So I have to begin answering that question by saying that immigration flows respond to historical and structural factors. There's a slogan in the UK among immigrant rights organizations that say, "We are here because you were there." Immigration flows in the post-World War II period have come from former colonies into former colonial powers. This is why migrants from Pakistan, from India, from Jamaica are in the UK. This is why immigrants from Algeria and Syria are in France. And this is why immigrants from Mexico and Central America are in the United States, are coming to the United States. The former colonial powers have not ceased what people in formerly colonized countries call neo-colonial relations, even after independence. This means the imposition of economic models that continue the colonial extractive regime, continue the privileging of foreign corporations, and back to the same old thing, the taking of native lands and the exploitation of native labor in the interests of foreign corporations and of increasing the standard of living in the colonizing or post-colonizing countries. So if you look at any former colonial power, they are trying to maintain these relations of power and the privilege they have accrued for themselves through the process of colonialism by putting up borders. They didn't ask anybody's permission when they went and colonized African countries, Latin American countries, Asian countries. But now they say, oh, borders are sacred. We can't let anybody cross a border. That is a privilege of the white colonizing countries. And it's a way they are trying to maintain global economic inequality. So the answer to your question is no. There is no former colonial power that is now working for a more equal and just world. All of the former colonial powers are trying to maintain their privilege that they accrued through the exploitation of poor people of color in the third world, and part of the way they do that is through the border regime.
Even Germany, when you read Go, Went, Gone, you can see that, the apologia for the Nazi time period and an effort to try to make up for that we see in Merkel's, efforts to try to bring and compel Europeans to bring more migrants into their country. Even there, you quickly see has its own limitations that are dramatic. And I just want to point out, too, that during the Clinton administration, of course, the prisons were also expanded and overpopulated. Another kind of interior border that we have that was created, and we addressed some of that this fall at our opening meeting. Questions from others, Lana.
First generation American here, and yes, I cook with garlic. I want to try and bring this conversation back to your initial effort around local action and the importance of local action. You've talked about legislation. I'm one of multiple members of the State League who works on legislative areas. My area is climate change, but you are clear in how these policies affect every area. So with regard to the legislation, there's a piece that we don't really think about, and that is the fact that even with legislation that has many, many co-sponsors, lots of advocacy support, those bills do not make it to the floor. So now we're into more internal mechanics of the House of Representatives, for example, where there seems to be a structure of rules that will prevent legislation that many legislators and many advocates support. And I understand that there is an effort around rules reform that is occurring, and in fact, the latest knowledge I have on this is that there is going to be a debate.
Can I interrupt you for a second? Can everybody hear her?
No.
Could you please come up here, because I'm not going to be able to repeat your question, but I think it's an important one for everyone to hear.
Well, not repeat all of it, but to the heart of it, right? Yeah, because it's very important.
I realize you're looking for a succinct.
Yes, yeah.
I was tasked with repeating the questions, and I was starting to see there was no way I was going to be able to repeat this one.
Thank you. So the issue that I was trying to raise,
Closer to the microphone.
Thank you for your.
Closer.
Okay, can you hear? Oh my goodness. The issue I was trying to raise is that before we get to legislation, there are structures and procedures within the House of Representatives and the Senate, but primarily I'm focused on the House at this point, that are constrained by, quote, rules of operation within the House. So, for example, we can have many legislators co-sponsoring legislation, many advocates pushing like crazy to get that legislation passed, and yet those bills often do not even make it to the floor for a vote. I understand there is an effort afoot to get rules reform within the House. It's an internal sort of mechanics within the House. And I guess the question that I have is, what can we, as people who are concerned about democracy and transparency in government, what can we do to influence or somehow make it known that we absolutely, as constituents, believe that it's time for reform of the rules in the House so that legislation can move forward? Still wasn't succinct, but I know.
So I'm almost tempted to turn that question over to you guys. Do you have anything you want to say about it?
I can say 1 minute. So yes, there is an effort afoot. There has been one since I was elected to address rules. I think what I've observed is exactly what you've highlighted. Safe communities didn't make it through. There was a number of bills that don't make it to the floor. And if you look at the structural issues, that's where we need to start if we want to make sure good legislation gets passed this session. We are in formal session for the first time on Wednesday. We will be taking up the rules discussion. A number of us have already put forth to Speaker DeLeo some rules amendments, which will be, if there are a number of co-sponsors, the bill can come out of committee and at least be taken up on the floor as to whether or not there's action. You may or may not be aware that all bills get a hearing and all bills need to get reported out of their primary committee. Where bills tend to go die is in Ways and Means. Ways and Means is not required to report out bills. That's why a lot of stuff just ends up there and never sees the light of day. So the idea is that with this committee discharge amendment that we would be able to loosen some of those bills and get them onto the House floor. The other thing is, oftentimes lawmakers do not have any more than 24 hours or even sometimes 12 hours to review a bill. So we're asking for at least 48 or 72 hours to review every single bill that we will be taking up in that next formal session, and at least 30 minutes to review amendments. Sometimes there are hundreds of amendments to a bill. There were, I think, like 200 or 300 amendments to the healthcare bill last session, and nobody really got to see a lot of those amendments before they had to vote on them. So talking about democracy, talking about access to government and transparency, and talking about trying to get good legislation passed. So I'm pushing on this effort. I encourage the League, if it's possible, to work with other affiliates throughout the state to reach out to lawmakers to make sure that they're helping those of us who are working really hard to get some of these rules reforms passed. It happens Wednesday, so time is really short. So hope that helps. Thank you.
Yes, yeah. Norma.
Yeah, I wanted to just make a comment on the comment that Tammy just made. And I want you all to understand very carefully.
Do you want to come to the microphone?
Let me get finance. Make it. Okay? No? Okay, all right, thanks.
I want you all to notice Norma's extraordinary T-shirt.
It says, sorry about my president.
In many languages.
Yes, 14 languages, in case anybody is...
right up to the microphone.
Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
So, I just wanted to make a quick comment on what Tammy had to say. the rules reform is very important. But I do want you to understand that the legislature, at any time, votes to suspend the rules and then does whatever they want to do. So, although rules reform is very important, if you're really interested in transparency, we need to start keeping track of how many times and when they suspend the rules to do whatever it is they want to do when they want to do it. That's number one. Number two, which I think is even more critical, is that you must not discount the lobbying on the other side of whatever you think is good and right and just. And when we're talking about the Safe Communities Act, there is a huge law enforcement lobby in opposition. There are district attorneys who like being part of the ICE operation. And district attorneys speak very loudly to legislators. They are extremely powerful. They have an organization and a lobby. It always sounds as if, because we've amassed this vast group that we look around and see next to us, who all agree with us on this thing, as if we're going to be able to make something happen. You only make something happen if you make the effort to be there on lobby day and to be there on the phone and to be there to talk to people, because that's the only way you counteract the lobbyists on the other side. So if you're not part of the solution, you are part of the problem.
Yeah, the undoubtable Norma Shapiro. Thank you so much. Other questions from the audience? Yes, ma'am.
One of the pieces of information,
And this will probably be our last question.
I'll try to be quick, that's astonished me the most is the use of for-profit prisons as detention centers across the country. And so I have two questions. One is, what is the current profit level coming out of those places, and how much are they paid per day for each detainee? And another is, do we have in Massachusetts any of these for-profit detention centers?
No.
I know we have a prison that's partly functioning as a detention center at Suffolk County, but I'm wondering if there are any private ones as well.
So I actually can't give you statistics off the top of my head in terms of the profit levels of the private prison companies, but I can, just following up on what we just heard about lobbying, talk a little bit about their political activism and influence. And in terms of how much do they make per day, the going rate is, I think, $124 or $100 and some per day. Per prisoner. And under the Obama administration is the first time that ICE was actually directed to fill at least 32,000 beds every single day. Those beds had to be filled, so they were operating under a quota system. So this was part of how the Obama administration managed to increase detention and deportation levels, because ICE was mandated to maintain those levels daily. And one of the reasons, of course, is the extraordinary lobbying power of not only law enforcement agencies, but the privatized parts of the prison system, the for-profit corporate aspect of the prison system, which includes not only the privately run prisons themselves, but the providers of prison services that have increasingly been privatized, like food services, cleaning services. The prison system, like the school systems, has been in a process of a multi-pronged process of privatization and increase of corporate profits. Some of the major companies involved in this for-profit security industry are very prominent members of ALEC, the American Legislation Exchange Council. Is that right?
Legislative Exchange Council.
Legislative Exchange Council, a very high-powered lobbying group that actually brings together corporations, corporate leaders, and legislators to design legislation under the auspices of the interests of corporations, which the legislators then introduce into Congress and which then get passed. While the public, we elect our representatives, we don't elect those corporate leaders, we don't even know who they are, and yet they are the ones authoring the legislation that our elected representatives, not you guys, I hope, are then introducing and promoting. So the private prison industry, which again I emphasize, it's not just the private prisons themselves, but a whole infrastructure of agencies providing services for our system of mass incarceration, which of course has also been growing exponentially. And I would just go back to my original statement that this is part of the taking of native land and labor for the profit of private corporations.
I don't know how to thank Aviva enough for everything we've learned this morning. What an amazing person.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Tammy has just given me something that speaks directly to everything that Norma and she and Aviva have spoken to us about. There's a Safe Communities Lobby Day on Wednesday, Wednesday, January 30th from 1 to 3. Tell your legislators it's time to lead. I'll repeat, Safe Communities Lobby Day, Wednesday, January 30th, 1 to 3. Tell your legislatures it's time to lead. We are so fortunate to have had Aviva, so grateful for all of you. I hope we see you next Friday, at the first Friday, in which we'll be discussing climate issues and essentially what's happening to our earth on which we walk, because it's fragile. Thank you all very much. Have a good day.